Sometime last December, I came across Gatsby open sourcer Matt Kane. He was tweeting away and sharing screenshots of what seemed like a brand new Gatsby Image Plugin. It was only right that I began to research around to see what this auto-magical plugin was all about. Interestingly enough, much of this work was coming out of a brand new developer experience team. So I reached out to staff software engineer at Gatsby, Laurie Barth, to dispense the details of this beta Gatsby Image Plugin. Enjoy.
If you're familiar with Gatsby, you know that we have a plugin ecosystem, and so images are designed to work using plugins. And so there's two plugins that I'm going to talk about today. The first is Gatsby Plugin Sharp, which under the hood is processing all of your images in the various formats. So WebP, we're going to talk about AVIF, and Gatsby Plugin Image, which is a plugin that surfaces a couple of components for you to use in order to display your images and create the DOM structure that allows for optimal performance. So without further ado, I want to talk about what this API looks like and sort of how you go about using it with some examples. So we have our initial page, and we're going to grab a component from Gatsby Plugin Image called Static Image. There is a secondary component called Gatsby Image that we make available, and that's for data that you're processing using GraphQL, so dynamic information. For images where you actually know what you're trying to access, whether that be a URL or a relative file path, you can use Static Image. It's essentially the same as using an IMG element in regular HTML, but when you use this component, we create a DOM structure that has fallbacks and source set and all sorts of optimizations for you. So it's the fastest and best way to get started working with images. So let's look at some of the things that you can do. I'm going to start with the first thing that everyone's talking about today, which is image types. So when you're working with images, it can be a JPEG, it can be a PNG, all these different image types. And by default, Gatsby does two things. It takes the image type that you have, so let's say it's a JPEG, it'll generate JPEG images, and it will also generate WebP images. A lot of modern browsers support WebP, so this is nice. If WebP isn't supported, the JPEG image is still available in your DOM structure, and so it'll still show up on your page. So let's show an example of what this looks like by default. So we have our static image component. We'll close that. By default, we ask that you always have an alt. Colorful umbrellas in the sky, because that's what we're going to grab. And I'm going to grab a source that I've already stolen from Unsplash. Thanks, Unsplash. And this is just a URL. So run it real quickly and you can see what happens. You get this nice image. So if we look under the hood here, we can see that we have image/WebP that's being served. However, there are also JPEGs that are available. So if I was on a browser that didn't support WebP, that would be fine. You can also override this behavior in a couple of different ways. So you can take formats. By default, this is what this looks like. WebP and auto. Missing my curly braces there. So we could remove WebP and it wouldn't generate WebP. We can also add AVIF. And now we have, we can see that there is AVIF support. Whoops. These are all AVIF images. And then there's also WebP as fallback. And then there's also JPEG as fallback for that. So that's pretty incredible. We're generating all these different types of images and the browser will take whichever one it's able to render. Now, formats are just one type of thing that this component can take, and one type of way in which we've optimized this experience. So another thing that you may want to do, and I'm just going to remove this because we don't need to show AVIF every time, is layout. And layout is us making intelligent decisions about what types of image sizes you might want to use. So the one that everyone sort of thinks of first is a fixed image size. And this is really big because it's fixed and it's the size of the source image. And so it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and it goes bigger than my screen, but it also doesn't get smaller than my screen, right? I'm going to introduce height and width just to make this a little bit easier for us. So let's say the width was 500 to make this easier to see. So we can make it smaller and it doesn't actually get smaller. This is always going to be the same size. It's not a responsive image. It is a fixed image. Alternatively, we have sort of on the completely opposite side of this, a full width image. And a full width image is designed to be the full width of your screen. Responsive, it gets bigger, it gets smaller, but it's always decided to be the full width of the container. It's great for hero images. It generates very large images so that you're not. It can stretch beyond the size of the source image. But the main layout that we expect most people to want is constrained. And what constrained does is it is a responsive image, just like full width is. It gets smaller, it gets bigger, but it only gets as big as the source image. So you won't have this weird situation where all of a sudden things are very blurry because you're trying to make the image a lot bigger than its original source is. You can also decide to pass, let's say, a width or a height that will constrain the image further. So in this case, we can have 800 and it won't get bigger than that, but it will get smaller than that, and then it'll stop. So that's probably the ideal layout for most people, where you can constrain width and you can constrain height. Now, interestingly enough, if you wanted to force a specific aspect ratio, you could do the same thing. Let's say 21/9, movie style, as I like to call it. This crops the image and forces the height to match. If I had set height for this and then run it again, it's going to listen to the height and then aspect ratio the width. If I give it width and height, which is a bad aspect ratio, doesn't make any sense really, it will ignore aspect ratio. It'll listen to height and width to calculate that aspect ratio. So there's a lot of different sizing things that you can do. So I know I'm going really fast, and there's a lot of stuff to do here, but I wanted to dive into one of the things that you might not have noticed is happening. So if we turn off the opacity here, there is a placeholder that shows up on the page before our image loads. So this is what gets you that nice performant lighthouse score, and one of those things that we handle for you. This is a base 64 blurred image that's getting generated, and so it has that nice sort of ease effect where it changes opacity and puts your new image on top of that. That is not the only placeholder that we have. So we'll keep our height and width. No, we won't. We'll make our width 800. And we'll still do a constrained image, but let's look at the different placeholders that you can have. You can have placeholder none. Where it happened so fast, we almost didn't see it, but there is no placeholder here. The image is just empty. And with placeholder none, you can use background color. And let's say we wanted it to be blue, like a really bright, obnoxious blue. We can get that. And then that's what will show up before our image shows up. That's not what most people want. Most people are actually probably going to want dominant color. And dominant color is really cool. It's what Twitter does when they create their images. So it actually generates the dominant color of the image. This is a calculated color based on the different hues that exist in this image, which is cool. You can do the blurred that we saw before, and then you can also do traced SVG, which I think is pretty fun. And you might have seen it quickly there, but just so we can see it again. You have this sort of shape that shows up. And then there's random things that exist on this component that just like, why does anyone want to do them? I don't know, but you can. So transform options, you can do grayscale. And then you get a grayscale image. You can do this thing called Duotone, where you take an object with two different keys, highlight and shadow. And I'm going to steal these red ones that I have. And then we have this weird red duotone image. You can also do rotate. So you could do rotate 180. So that's flipped, but you can also do rotate 30, which is just something like that. So there's lots of transformation things that you can do that let you mess around with your images. The last thing I want to mention is something that I think is important for performance, and that's sort of what we're talking about today, which is loading equals eager. So by default, part of the performance gain is that all of your images are lazy loaded, and we have an intersection observer so that, you know, the placeholder and that blur up effect is happening as people are navigating down your page. You're not loading images unnecessarily if they're not actually visible to the user. Loading equals eager is for images you know will always show up above the fold, and so you want to make sure that they appear as quickly as possible. And so that gives you the ability to do that. Now, one thing I did want to show is the fact that all of this works without JavaScript, and it all works without React as well. So at build time, we generate all the images that you need to use, and we create the DOM structure that it works inside. So all of this is essentially HTML that's already generated for you. And so if you were to turn off JavaScript and reload this page, it doesn't affect images at all. So two things that I didn't mention in there. One is that the eager images, those eager images actually get loaded before React hydration, which is why you add eager to it. And then I mentioned intersection observer, but we are also using native lazy loading for browsers that have that. So something to keep in mind. And I have not looked at the chat yet, so I don't know if there are questions.
I mean, there have been, but I have to say this. You know, if you're the point guard, Kyle is
KG. KG is my teammate who did a lot of work on this as well, and I'm really happy he's here. So I should have expected nothing less.
I mean, Kyle's like the shooting guard here. You know, and I'm like, what's going on here? It's back and forth. It's like the assists are going, you know, back and forth between you two. I'm like, yo, this is kind of awesome.
Yeah. So Gatsby plugin image is it's in beta. It is the new replacement for the old Gatsby image. So Lighthouse changed the way it calculated things. Image formats have gotten more modern. The way that we work with native APIs in browsers, support for things like native lazy loading and intersection observer has gotten better since Gatsby image was released probably 2 or 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so we did a rewrite, and we said we have opportunities to really make some massive improvements here for our users, for performance. And I mean, I don't know about you, but doing images in browsers and making them performant and making them work on all kinds of different screens, and that's like, it's not easy. Like, we wrote the thing and it's not easy. So having this stuff built in and having framework level or CMS level, in the case of Sanity, like handling that for you, that's a really great win for everybody, because it makes images better on the internet, regardless of whether people have gone through like the deep dive of the difference between X size images and W size images, which it's a whole thing.
Yeah, yeah, and that's absolutely true. Which is essentially why I wanted to sort of organize this, because again, when I talk about the first event I've done is really like codec level discussions, which is awesome, but it's not necessarily the developer experience that I knew was which you know unfortunately provided a little bit of struggle at times for some people, if not a lot. And I knew with everyone sort of having that discussion online, I thought this was very apropos. So thank you very much for that. Now, like I said, Kyle's been